This is the last lecture of period 2. We're continuing with our key concept that the British colonies participated in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Great Britain that encouraged stronger bonds with Britain and also encouraged resistance to Britain's control. And today we're going to focus on how, like other European empires in the America that participated in the Atlantic slave trade, the English colonies developed a system of slavery that reflected the specific economic, demographic, and geographic characteristics of these individual colonies. So this is a really long point that I'm going to make, so stay with me. All the British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade because there was an abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods, as well as a shortage of indentured servants. So even in small New England farms, where there were relatively few enslaved laborers, there were even more in port cities, and there was, of course, the majority of people who were enslaved were used on plantations in the Chesapeake and south on the Atlantic coast. So even in New England and the middle colonies, there was slavery. However, the majority of slavery was in the southern and Chesapeake colonies. The majority, however, of enslaved Africans were sent to the West Indies to both Spanish and French and British sugar plantations. So our example I'm going to use is the plantation agriculture. I know it says example 2. It should say 1. Plantation agriculture was based on agricultural mass production of crops for export. These are called cash crops. The cash crops in the colonies were rice, sugar, tobacco, and indigo. Planters in North America began using slavery when indentured servitude became very expensive. In Virginia, in 1665, there were fewer than 500 Africans. By 1750, less than 100 years later, 85% of the 235,000 African slaves in North America were in Virginia. In the West Indies, or the Atlantic Islands and Brazil, where mostly there were large sugar plantations, the slave mortality rate was so high that the majority of slaves imported through the Middle Passage ended up in this area of the world to make up for the frequent deaths of workers. Working on a sugar plantation and other things that we have in Brazil were backbreaking labor. As chattel slavery, because, again, these colonies are adjusting to their own specific types and forms of slavery, chattel slavery becomes the dominant labor system in many southern colonies. New laws create a strict racial system that prohibited interracial relationships and defined the descendants of African American mothers as Black and enslaved in perpetuity. And what that means is, in 1661, the English legislature legalized slavery in Barbados, the British colony in the West Indies. And it set the precedent that if you were Black, you were treated as a chattel property in the island's courts. Chattel slavery means you have slave status for those of African descent, and it considered you a slave for life. And slave statuses could be inherited, meaning if there were children who were born to slaves, that status of slavery was passed through the mother's bloodline. So if the mother was enslaved, the child would be enslaved for life. This is different than most of the rest of the world, where slavery was for a period of time, or the children of slaves were freed, or the owners would free slaves before the owner's death. That was not the case in Barbados or the southern colonies. It did not mean to, but it ended up protecting the masters, this 1661 Barbados Slave Code. It gave masters absolute power rather than protecting the slaves from harm. It also denied slaves civil rights that was guaranteed under the English law, such as the right to life. This law, the Barbados Slave Code, marked the beginning of legal codification of slavery. Later was adopted by South Carolina, Antigua, and Jamaica, and other British colonies using plantation agriculture. The Stono Rebellion took place in 1739. This was a slave rebellion near Charleston, South Carolina, next to the Stono River. Slaves gathered in the morning. They raided a firearms shop. They headed south, and they killed over 20 white people as they went. Other slaves joined the rebellion until the group totaled 60 members. The white community in Charleston, South Carolina retaliated. They pursued the group of slaves. They killed over half the group by nightfall, and the other half escaped. Most of the escaped rebellion leaders were eventually captured and executed. The slaves were potentially heading for St. Augustine in Florida, where freedom was promised to fugitive slaves by the Spanish. After the rebellion, something called the Negro Act was passed by white colonists in South Carolina to further limit slaves' privileges, and that law was very similar to the Barbados Slave Code. Another revolt happened in 1741, the New York City Slave Revolt. This is also called the Conspiracy of 1741, or the Negro Plot of 1741, or the Slave Insurrection of 1741. You'll see all of those in different papers. And again, I'm going to use some historical words that we do not say today, so please be aware and be sensitive to some of the words that I have to use. So this slave revolt was a supposed plot amongst poor whites and slaves to level New York City with a series of fires. Many historians disagree about the existence or the size of this actual plot, but in 1741, Manhattan had the second largest slave population in the colonies, second to Charleston. There were bad conditions, harsh winters, anti-Catholic and Spanish sentiment in this area. There was also a war with Britain going on, a fear of revolts happening in South Carolina and St. John in the Caribbean. In March, 13 fires erupt in lower Manhattan. 200 slaves are arrested for a conspiracy to murder and burn white New York inhabitants. 100 people are hung, exiled, or burned at the stake. And the court proceedings were very similar to the Salem witch trials. There wasn't any proof that there were conspirators or that this was led by slaves in New York, but that's who took the blame, and that's who was killed for these fires erupting. And the last point I'm going to make is that Africans developed both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing aspects of slavery and maintain their family and gender systems, culture, and religions despite slave codes that were passed throughout the colonies. So here are some forms of resistance. Slowdowns means slowing down work on plantations, pretending to be ill, starting fires, accidentally breaking tools. That was one of the easiest ways, and very dangerous, but easiest ways to resist working on a plantation and trying to throw a wrench in slavery, if you will. There were many runaway slaves who formed Maroon societies, I'll talk about in a minute. And then there were slave rebellions in Barbados, Demerara, Jamaica, the Stoner Rebellion, potentially the New York Slave Revolt. 4.5 enslaved Africans were transported to North America, while 93% actually went to Brazil, the Spanish Caribbean, and the West Indies. And I do want to point that out, that the majority of people coming from Africa to the New World who would be sold into slavery did not actually get to North America. So that shows you that vast number of people who were displaced in this time period. And so if you want to take a look at this, you can pause. Take a look at where people went and where people ended up and where people come from. And then finally, we have the Maroon societies. These are communities formed of runaway slaves. They established societies in remote areas for protection to avoid being sold back into slavery. There were 3 types of Maroon societies. One were bands of runaway men who raided towns. 2, towns of people who developed trade with outside communities. And then 3, there were actually Maroon societies of people who grew crops and maintained semi-permanence. And one of the closest Maroon societies to us was the Great Dismal Swamp community in North Carolina and Virginia mountain area. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.